Hello, Lifegroup friends. My name is Gary Briggs. I get the privilege of talking about session 12 in our quarterly book. What I thought I'd do is share with you kind of my approach as to what I'm going to do in my life group this coming Sunday, and that's just to kind of do a review. We've been in Jeremiah now for 12 weeks, and it's been a great study. I've learned a lot that's really challenged me, and there's so many good things. It's a kind of a sad book in the Bible due to the rebellion of God's people against Him and His promises, and the rejection and their idolatry, which has brought about the judgment. But I thought I'd take a second, and you can handpick whichever lessons you like where things kind of jump out to you. But I just kind of flipped through from lesson 1 through today, and even last Sunday, sessions 11, and thought I'd just throw out a few things that kind of came to my mind. I made my notes here. In session 1, it's interesting how God had chosen Jeremiah before he was even born, and equipped him to be a prophet, and he had a plan, and that was very obvious. Even though he was fearful of his youth and inexperience, God said He would protect him and help him. So good takeaways for us as the same promise. We can trust in God to help us and overcome what we think are our weaknesses. Session 2, very, very clear about the judgments and the warnings and the concern God had for His people who were following and worshiping false gods and false idols, and I've got my little paper plate here we made and keep in our room, that God is a God of love, but God is also a God of judgment, and that came through very clear to me in session 2. Then it's interesting as I kind of look through how God used so many different approaches, different sermons, different ways through Jeremiah, how He would impress upon Jeremiah and call him, and the word of the Lord would come to him. And the session 5 with the whole potter's clay, and how that was such a great object lesson to kind of remind your class of the importance to be moldable, to be pliable, to be willing to be shaped by God. Session 7, again, one of the famous verses we talk about, and I'll just read it again in chapter 29, verse 29 or verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And the discussion we had in our life group was, does that verse only apply to Jeremiah, or can it apply to us today? And we concluded that it can apply to everyone, that God does have a plan to prosper us and give us a hope and a future. Session 8 was very interesting as well. There's 2 or 3 things there. I'm going to look back to page 70 real quick. At the middle part, verse 31, you see the words "a new covenant." The Lord declares, when I make a new covenant, and it's like, well, we know the new covenant was Jesus. And then verse 33, how the Lord declared, I will put my teaching within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. And I think about how at salvation God puts His Spirit in our heart as a deposit for what is to come. I think that's in Corinthians, that verse. So that talks about that kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come, that new covenant that would be happening. Session 10 was a kind of a sad story about the king who wouldn't listen, who absolutely would not listen, and didn't want to hear, and tore up the scroll and burned it. And fortunately, God had Jeremiah and his scribe redo that. But it's the importance of listening to God's word and applying it to our heart was the takeaway I had. Session 11 we just had last week about God's judgment on those who reject Him, and the people who heard directly, they petitioned Jeremiah to go to God, and they got the word from God what to do, and then they rejected it. And then here we are at session 12, which our last session in Jeremiah, and one more this quarter. And the takeaway I got from chapter 50 is that God is always in control of all the world events. His timing talks about Jeremiah's prophecy in chapter 50 and 51 is kind of future prophecy on not only historic Babylon as back in those days, but also kind of the future. And there's, if you read, our session starts in verse 11 of chapter 50, but if you start in verse 1 of chapter 50, which I recommend you do, it talks about how Babylon will be invaded by a stronger nation from the north. And if you get into, which I didn't too deep, but you get into kind of the prophetic words of Jeremiah and what did happen historically, and has that prophecy in the chapter completely been fulfilled? And it has not, but we know that God's word is true and that it will be. So and even in our book, I'll refer you to that on page 105. It says the fall of Babylon, this is at the end of the page here, the fall of Babylon Empire was but a foretaste of the day of the Lord, when we will once and for all defeat and eradicate his enemies and the enemies of his people, as John described in Revelations 18. And I remember that the whole chapter 18 in Revelations, which we just completed the sermon series, talks about the fall of Babylon. So if you want to and are brave enough to dig into some pretty deep prophecies there, you can maybe have some discussion on that, and whether it's the Babylon of historic Babylon, or is that analogous to some other city of Babylon or nation of Babylon. And some people even have the idea that may even represent the United States of America. So you might want to look at that if you have some time. But so in today's lesson, session 12, it's very descriptive. We start in verse 11, very descriptive of what's going to happen to Babylon, what's going to be the judgment that God brings upon them. And it was always kind of a question I had, and maybe you had. It's like, why would God use a more wicked, more rebellious nation of Babylon to bring judgment, his judgment upon, even though they were rebellious and wicked, they seemed like Judah was less than Babylon. And I think God explains that. In fact, in our book, the author, commentator in our book on page 101 says, certainly God used these nations, and that's the surrounding nations. We know of Egypt and some of the surrounding nations, and especially Babylon. Certainly God used these nations as instruments of judgment against Judah, but the fact that God uses a person or nation to fulfill his purposes does not excuse their sins. And that's really the kind of foundational sentence that sets up today's lesson. God's bringing judgment on Babylon for their sins. And their sins were many. One of the things, they were haughty, they were arrogant, they actually adopted an attitude, from what I understand, thinking if they were successful in defeating Judah, then apparently their gods were more powerful than Judah's gods. And we know their idols were not. That what had happened wasn't because of their idols, their gods, little g gods. It was because the God allowed that to happen and used Babylon as a tool of judgment to punish and discipline Judah for their rebellion against and their breaking the covenant that God had established with them way back centuries ago with their forefathers. So we know that God is always in control. The key verses for me in today's lesson is really verse 20 and kind of the end of the lesson said, in those days and at that time, this is the Lord's declaration. One will search for Israel's iniquity, but there will be none, and for Judah's sins, but they will not be found. For I will forgive those I leave as a remnant. So in that one verse, you see about God's forgiveness, His mercy, His grace, and we know the definitions of mercy and grace, giving us what we don't deserve and not giving us what we do deserve, and the forgiveness there, and how God separates the sins, we know, as far as the east is from the west for us, and like He is going to do for them and not remember them anymore. And then in verse 34, it says, their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of armies is His name. He will fervently champion their cause so that He might bring rest to the earth, but turmoil to those who live in Babylon. So in the same sentence, same verse, you see the contrast of rest in God versus turmoil when people reject God and rebel against Him. So it's this continual picture of good against evil, spiritual warfare that continues and will continue to the end. And I think back again to Revelations and the series we finished, as well as Revelations 18, where it talks about the ultimate destruction and fall of Babylon. So that's going to be my approach for this Sunday, is just to review and recap. I think it's always good to do that and highlight some of the key points from the different. And you can use the ones I brought up or the ones you choose. That's obviously your prerogative. But to remind people that we are responsible for keeping our covenant, our agreement to God, that we will follow Him and trust Him and obey Him. So hopefully you have a good lesson, and those are some of my thoughts. I'm going to wrap it up with that. Thank you. Have a good week.